Hi everyone, my name is Karin Wilsenach and I'm a member of staff in the Department of Linguistics and Modern Languages at UNISA. This presentation will focus on research design and methodology. If you have any questions after you've watched the content, you are very welcome to contact me. My email address is at the bottom of this slide. You may wonder why it's important to design your research before you start your research project. I think this cartoon clearly illustrates why you need to have a clear research plan as early as possible. In what seems to be a discussion between a professor and his student, the professor wants to know how his student is progressing with his research. The student says that he is running a bit behind and that he doesn't know where he is supposed to be at this point in time. The student then says that he is even running behind figuring out where he is supposed to be. The professor dryly suggests that the student maybe needs to run faster. But the anxious-looking student responds by asking, "But where am I running to?" If you do not have a clear research design, you might end up in a situation where you do not know what the next step in your research is. You may end up running in circles, which may delay your project. Even worse, if your methodology turns out to be flawed, you may end up having to start all over again. Conceptualizing a research design is not an easy task, especially not if you are an inexperienced researcher. Think about this. In order to design your research successfully, you need the following tools. You need a feasible question, which means that you need to come up with a research question that can be investigated in the real world. You need knowledge of the main construct of your study, as well as an understanding of all the concepts that are related to the main construct. You need theoretical competence, which means that you need to understand current theories related to your topic, and possibly you also need to be able to critically reflect on theories in your field that have been rejected. You need methodological and technical competence, which means that you need to be able to decide whether your research question is best answered using a quantitative or a qualitative paradigm. And you need to be able to design data collection tools that are in line with the paradigm that you chose. You need analytical competence, which means that you need to know how to analyze your data. You also need knowledge of institutional processes, for instance, how to obtain ethical clearance. And finally, you need knowledge of the practicalities of working in the field. For example, you might need to know how to find participants and how to identify suitable research settings. Depending on your project, you may also have to appoint field workers and train them and draw up detailed schedules to ensure that everyone knows when they are supposed to collect data in a particular setting. It is normal to feel quite overwhelmed by this task, but conceptualizing your research design does not have to be a nightmare, at least not if you approach it in a systematic way. I thought it might be helpful to go over a couple of formal definitions of the term research design. The first definition by Edmonds and Kennedy is very straightforward and easy to understand. According to them, the research design is the structure or framework that indicates the time frame in which the data was collected, how the data was collected, and how many participants or participant groups were involved in the research. The second definition by Creswell is more complex, as it contains more of the elements that we associate with a research design. According to Creswell, a research design is a description of the methods and procedures that are used to collect and analyze information related to the variables which are specified in the research problem. The research design explains the type of study, the research problem, the hypotheses, the independent and dependent variables, the data collection methods, and, if applicable, statistical analysis plan. But simply put, the research design is a framework that we create to find answers to our research questions. Most people find it very helpful to approach their research design in a stepwise manner. This schematic representation of the research design suggests that there are at least 3 phases in creating your research design. The first phase is called the pre-production phase. This is followed by the production phase, and the last phase is the post-production phase. Each of these phases contains one or more steps. For instance, in the pre-production phase, the first step is to identify your research problem and to translate this problem into a research question. Potentially, you also want to formulate a research hypothesis. The second step in the pre-production phase is to really work out the nitty-gritty stuff of your research design. Once you have formulated your research question, you need to select your methodological approach. You need to decide how you're going to operationalize your variables, how you're going to develop your materials. You need to craft procedures. You need to determine how large your sample is going to be. And you might need to do a pilot study in order to determine whether your research is practical. In the second phase, the production phase, you have to actually collect the data. This is where you recruit your subjects, where you actually go into the field and you collect your data. In the rest of this lecture, we will focus mainly on the pre-production and the production phases. Let's start with the first step of the first phase of your research design, namely the research question. Your research question forms the core of your research and it informs your research design. For this reason, it's really important that you have a very solid research question. A good research question is a question that is concise, specific, and clear. It is a question that is justifiable given existing knowledge. It is a question that is worthwhile asking. In other words, it has some application in the real world. And it is a question that is feasible. In other words, it is reasonable to assume that you will be able to answer this question. Remember that if you want to design your research well, you need knowledge of the construct that you intend to study, as well as knowledge of the theories that have been developed to explain this construct. Developing a deep understanding of your topic and of relevant theories in the field forms an essential part of the first step of your research design. The reason for this is that you cannot formulate a good research question without these tools. The better your knowledge of the construct and the better your theoretical competence, the better your research question will be. We seldom stop to think how theories are formed or why there are so many theories that all attempt to explain the same thing. I want to take a moment to explain how facts become theories, as it will hopefully help you to better understand the process of theory building, which forms part of theoretical competence. On the left-hand side of this figure, there are 4 blue circles. Imagine that the 2 top circles represent second language learning in context A, and the bottom 2 circles represent second language learning in context B. In both contexts, similar events occur. For instance, language learners have to write tests, regardless of where they are learning and regardless of which language they are learning. Scholars interested in language learning might observe that certain variables, such as motivation, influences learners' performance in a test. If scholars discover that there is a positive relationship between motivation and test performance in different contexts, then this relationship seems to be a law. The discovery of consistent laws leads to the formulation of theories. So, theories are in fact just an attempt to explain why laws exist the way they do. Once a theory is proposed, scholars will use it to make predictions about a construct in their particular context. Using the existing theory, a researcher in context C might hypothesize that increased motivation to learn a language will lead to higher test scores. If the researcher in context C also finds a positive relationship between motivation and language test scores, the theory is reinforced. However, if the researcher in context C finds no relationship between motivation and test performance, confidence in the theory is reduced. Over time, as more research is performed, it becomes clear whether a theory may be accepted, whether it needs to be adapted, or whether it needs to be rejected. As you have seen in the previous slide, an important skill associated with theoretical competence is the ability to formulate a hypothesis. Let's quickly look at the 2 types of reasoning that are used in hypothesis formulation. The first type of reasoning is inductive reasoning. Induction is a bottom-up process in which we move from a singular case to a law. For example, I can hypothesize that because I am a man and because I am mortal, all of mankind is mortal. The second type of reasoning is deduction. Here, we move from a theory to a singular case. So, I can hypothesize that because all of mankind is theoretically mortal, and because I am a man, I am mortal. Inductive reasoning is often used in science, but not always logically valid, since it may be the case that the general principle is incorrect. It is illogical to assume an entire premise just because one specific data point seems to suggest it. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, relies on the initial premise being correct. This is why a hypothesis can never be completely proved, because there is always the possibility that the initial premise is incorrect. Let's proceed to the second step of the pre-production phase of creating your research design. Remember that at this point you need to rely on your methodological competence. As you need to select your overarching methodological approach, you need to decide how you are going to collect your data, you need to identify your research setting and sample, and you need to craft your research procedures. If you have studied the various methodological paradigms sufficiently, you will be able to identify the research paradigm that will most likely give you reliable answers to your research question and which will allow you to test your research hypothesis. Remember that the three most prominent research paradigms in the human sciences are the quantitative paradigm, the qualitative paradigm, and the mixed methods paradigm. We will focus mostly on what it entails to be competent in quantitative methodology, as this is the focus of this course. Competence in quantitative research methodology entails that you know this research paradigm is associated with designs that use correlational methods, quasi-experimental methods, or a pre-test, post-test design, as in intervention studies, or it can be a combination of any of these methods. Methodological competence also entails that you know which data collection tools to consider. In linguistics, it can be standardized surveys or tests that you create yourself, tools that elicit behavioral responses or time data, eye tracking tools, or any other experimental tools. Also, you need to know how to ensure that your data collection procedures are standardized. You need to know how to select a representative sample. And finally, you should be able to design a pilot study to test whether your study is viable and to test whether your measuring instruments are valid and reliable. Deciding what your sample should look like also forms part of the pre-production phase of your research design. It is important to distinguish between the terms population and sample. The population includes all the people residing in a specific area. It is impossible to include the entire population in a research study, and so researchers need to identify a target population, which includes all the people that share certain characteristics that are interesting in a particular study. For example, if you are interested in literacy development in grade 1, all first graders will form part of your target population. It is also not possible to include the entire target population in a study, and therefore a sample that is available for study, for instance first graders residing in the researcher's town, is selected from the target population. Two questions that are often asked with regards to the study sample is, how big should the sample be, and what sampling technique should I use? Regarding the size of the sample, the general rule is the bigger your sample, the better, especially when you need to conduct inferential statistics on your data. If your sample is too small, your statistical analysis will lack power, which means your results will be less robust. Practically, it is not always possible to test large groups of people, but you should include at least 30 people in your sample, and if you plan to compare groups, you need to include at least 30 people in each group. In studies that have a correlational component, I normally aim to include at least 60 people in every subgroup. Your sampling technique really depends on your research design and is determined by questions such as, do I need the same number of males and females in my sample? Do I need to create balanced groups in terms of IQ and age? Can I travel to distant places to collect data from people? And so on. Sampling techniques can be divided into two categories, namely probability sampling and non-probability sampling. In probability sampling, each population member has a known, non-zero chance of participating in the study. Randomization or chance forms the core of probability sampling, and simple random sampling is most commonly used. In non-probability sampling, on the other hand, sample group members are selected non-randomly. Therefore, in non-probability sampling, only certain members of the population has a chance to participate in the study. Convenience sampling is probably the most commonly used type of non-probability sampling, and it entails that the researcher selects a sample based on what is convenient in terms of logistics, costs, and so on, while still keeping in mind that the selected sample should share the characteristics that the researcher is interested in. With regards to the sample, remember that the sample is a subgroup of the target population that the researcher plans to study for the purpose of making generalizations about the target population. But samples are only estimates, and the difference between the sample estimate and the true population is the sampling error. Remember to include demographic information such as age, gender, ethnicity, and linguistic profile of your sample. Also remember to include the procedures that you use to select your sample and include a justification for your sampling method. All of this should be included in your sampling procedure. I've included an example here of how you can write up your sampling procedure. You can read this example in your own time. It is important to specify the research procedure as part of the production phase of your research design. This is the how-to section of the study, and it will introduce the design of the research and how the data was collected in order to answer the questions of interest. The information in your research procedure should be presented in a step-by-step fashion. If you write this section well, any other researcher will be able to replicate the study without asking too many questions. We still have to discuss the time horizons of your research design. Recall that Edmonds and Kennedy said that a research design should indicate the time frame in which the data was collected. In quantitative research, we typically have to decide whether our research design is going to be cross-sectional or longitudinal. In a cross-sectional design, all the data is collected at one point in time. In contrast, a longitudinal design allows for multiple observations or assessments over a period of time. Both of these time frames have strengths and weaknesses. Let's consider cross-sectional studies first. Cross-sectional studies works well for exploratory and descriptive studies. It's very cost efficient and it is less complicated in terms of logistics. The biggest disadvantage of a cross-sectional design is that it is complicated to try and understand causal relationships when observations were collected at one point in time. The main advantage of a longitudinal design is that it allows a researcher to draw conclusions on causal relationships. Furthermore, a longitudinal design also allows for more in-depth understanding of behavior over time. The weaknesses of a longitudinal design include that it is logistically complicated and very time-consuming, it's very expensive, and the researcher has to deal with attrition, which is when you lose participants as you go along. There are different types of longitudinal studies or longitudinal designs, namely trend studies, cohort studies, and panel studies. Trend studies are interested in changes within the general population over time. Cohort studies examine specific populations as they change over time. For instance, a group of people who enter or leave an institution at the same time. A panel study studies the same set of people 2 or more times over time. Longitudinal designs can take 2 directions. It can either be retrospective, which is where you ask participants to reflect on their past, but there are several limitations to this type of research, including that people cannot always remember what happened to them, incomplete records or unavailable records, and people can also be untruthful. The other type of direction in longitudinal designs is prospective research. This is when you begin with a sample and you follow their behavior or development into the future. In the final part of this presentation, we are going to consider one example of a quantitative research design. We'll go through the pre-production phase and the production phase of the research design, and I hope to convince you that it's really not so difficult to create your own research design. Okay, so the first step is that we need a research topic or constructs that we find interesting. Imagine that you are a researcher and you are interested in the constructs stress and achievement, or the variables stress and English language achievement. The first step in the pre-production phase is to create a research question. A possible research question in this study field could be, what is the relationship between stress and English second language test achievement? Can you identify the independent variable and the dependent variable in this research design? The dependent variable is, of course, English test achievement, and the independent variable is stress. The reason why I'm saying that is that English second language test achievement depends on stress levels. Another part of the first step of this phase of the research design is to derive a research hypothesis. For this, we actually need theoretical competence. So let us assume that high stress levels cause low English language test achievement. If this theory is true, we can hypothesize that there is a negative relationship between stress and English second language test achievement. In other words, as stress levels go up, test achievement levels go down. Since we are interested in the relationship between stress and achievement, we can say that we are adopting a correlational approach in this research design. It also has an explanatory component, as we are trying to explain the effect of stress on achievement. Let's try to answer these questions for our example. What is the time frame in which data will be collected? I would say that it can be either cross-sectional or longitudinal. If you opt for a cross-sectional design, you will have a snapshot of the relationship between these constructs. Whereas if you opt for a longitudinal design, you will be able to explore this relationship in more depth, and you will be able to see how the relationship changes over time. Will an intervention be implemented or not? No, there is no need for an intervention, as this is a correlational study. So we are only interested in looking at the relationship between two constructs. And the last question, how many participant groups will be involved? Well, I would say only one group, as you can determine the nature of this relationship in one participant group. We have completed the first step of the pre-production phase of our research design. We have identified a research topic, we formulated a research question, and we derived a research hypothesis. Following that, we determined that the research design will be correlational in nature. We decided that the research design can be either cross-sectional or longitudinal, and we determined that we only need to study one group of participants. Another detail that needs to be worked out at this point in the research design is how we are going to collect the data. In other words, what instruments are we going to use to operationalize the variables in our study? It seems that there are standardized measurements that we can use to assess stress and achievement. To measure stress, we can use the perceived stress scale, and to measure achievement, we can use the wide range achievement test. As part of the production phase, we will also describe the research procedure of our example quantitative research design. So we can say that initially students were invited to complete the informed consent forms. Only students who completed a consent form were included in the sample. Questionnaires were distributed and completed in English classes during the middle of the term. The PSS scale was administered to all students at the end of each period. The WRAT scale was then administered at the beginning of each period. Students were given as much time as needed to complete each assessment. In reality, a research procedure tends to be a little bit more complicated than I suggest here, but the purpose of this example is to clarify, not to complicate, so we leave it at that. In conclusion, remember this simple definition. A research design is a framework that has been created to find answers to research questions. The better your knowledge of the construct you want to study, theories in the field, methodological paradigms, data collection tools in the field, analytical tools, research procedures, and practical implications, the better your framework will be.